For months before my wedding, I found out my future mother-in-law had been secretly planning to invite her ex-husband's entire new family to my reception, including his second wife, a woman my fiancé hadn't spoken to civilly in almost a decade, without asking either of us first. That's honestly the smallest part of what ended up happening, but it's where all of this really started. I'm Olivia, 29, engaged to a man named Nathan, together for 5 years, planning a wedding for early June at a small vineyard about an hour outside Asheville, North Carolina. Nathan's parents divorced when he was 14, messy and public in a way that still shapes how his family interacts at gatherings over 15 years later. His father, Bill, remarried within 2 years to a woman named Sandra, and the relationship between Bill's new family and Nathan's mother, Linda, has remained tense ever since, the kind of tension everyone quietly manages around rather than actually resolves. Nathan and I built our guest list carefully months before any of this happened, specifically deciding, together, that Bill would be invited alone, without Sandra. A boundary Nathan felt strongly about given how difficult his teenage years had been navigating his father's new marriage while his mother was still grieving the end of her own. Linda knew about this decision from the very beginning and had actually thanked us for it, said she appreciated us being thoughtful about her comfort at our wedding. Which is exactly why what happened next completely blindsided both of us. About 4 months out, I got a call from the Vineyard's event coordinator, a friendly woman named Melissa who'd been helping us finalize catering numbers. She mentioned, casually, that she'd received an updated guest count inquiry from the mother of the groom, asking about accommodating 6 additional guests beyond our finalized headcount, and wanted to confirm the change with me directly since it affected the catering order. I had no idea what she was talking about. Nathan and I had submitted our final headcount 3 weeks earlier, and neither of us had requested any changes since. I called Linda immediately, assuming there had to be some mix-up. Instead, she calmly explained that she decided it was time to move past old tension and had reached out directly to Sandra, inviting her, Bill, and Sandra's 2 adult children from a previous marriage, along with Sandra's elderly mother, to attend, framing it as a generous, healing gesture she was confident Nathan and I would come around to appreciating once we saw how well everyone got along. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, why she hadn't spoken to either of us before making this decision, especially given the very clear boundary Nathan had set from the beginning specifically about Sandra's attendance. Her answer is the part that still sits with me even now. She said, and I'm quoting this closely, that she'd been the bigger person for 15 years, quietly managing her own discomfort around Bill's new family for everyone else's sake. And that she felt Nathan's wedding was the perfect opportunity to finally model real forgiveness for him, to show him what moving forward actually looked like, rather than continuing to let old resentment dictate who got invited to important family moments. I sat there stunned, because underneath the language of forgiveness and healing, what she was actually describing was making a unilateral decision about our wedding, overriding her own son's explicitly stated boundary, and framing it as a gift she expected us to be grateful for. I told her I needed to talk to Nathan before responding further, and hung up feeling like the wedding planning process, which had been genuinely smooth and low stress up until that phone call, had just shifted into something far more complicated than seating charts and catering counts. When I told Nathan that evening, watching his face shift from confusion to a very specific, tightly controlled anger I'd only seen a handful of times in 5 years together, I realized this wasn't just about an awkward guest list addition. This was about a boundary his mother had known, explicitly, was tied to some of the hardest years of his adolescence, and she had crossed it anyway, without so much as a conversation, for months before his wedding. Nathan called his mother the next morning, and I sat beside him at our kitchen table listening to one side of a conversation that made it clear this wasn't going to be resolved with a simple apology. He told her, calmly at first, that inviting Sandra without discussing it was a direct violation of something he'd been clear about since the very beginning of our planning process, and that he needed her to rescind the invitations immediately. Linda's response, from what I could piece together through Nathan's side of the call, was to reframe the entire conversation around her own feelings, saying she felt hurt that he wasn't even willing to consider her gesture, that she'd hoped after everything she'd sacrificed as a single mother, he could extend her this one request. I watched Nathan's jaw tighten in a way I recognized from a few difficult conversations over the years, always specifically tied to moments when his mother used their shared history of hardship as leverage in a current disagreement. He told her, firmly, that this wasn't about whether he appreciated her sacrifices, it was about a boundary he'd set specifically because of how painful his teenage years had been. And that her decision to override it without even a conversation felt like exactly the kind of dismissiveness that had made those years so hard in the first place. Linda didn't back down. Instead, she told him she'd already spoken with Sandra, that canceling now would be humiliating for everyone involved, and that maybe it was time Nathan considered whether holding on to 15-year-old resentment was really worth potentially damaging his relationship with his own mother right before his wedding. Nathan hung up more shaken than angry at that point, and told me he genuinely didn't know if this was going to resolve the way we both needed it to. 2 days later, Bill called Nathan directly, something that almost never happened given how infrequently the two of them spoke outside major holidays. Bill said Linda had called Sandra personally, and that Sandra, to her credit, according to Bill, had actually expressed hesitation about the whole idea from the start, sensing correctly that this wasn't really about genuine reconciliation, but about something else entirely happening within Linda's own unresolved feelings about the divorce. Bill told Nathan something that reframed the entire situation for both of us. He said Linda had recently found out, through a mutual friend, that Bill and Sandra were planning to renew their vows for their upcoming 15th wedding anniversary, a small private ceremony with close family, and that Linda's sudden push for a public reconciliation moment at our wedding had started almost immediately after hearing that news. Sitting there listening to Nathan relay this, something clicked into place that had been nagging at me since that first phone call. This had never actually been about modeling forgiveness for Nathan's benefit. It had been about Linda needing her own public moment, a chance to present herself as the bigger, more evolved person specifically in response to Bill and Sandra's happy milestone. Using our wedding as the stage for a reconciliation she needed for her own sense of closure, regardless of whether Nathan or I had actually asked for that. Nathan sat with that realization for a long time that evening, quiet in a way that told me this had shifted from frustration into something closer to genuine grief. The specific kind that comes from finally understanding a pattern you'd spent years not wanting to fully see clearly in a parent you still deeply loved. A week passed with an unusual quiet settling over the whole situation, Linda not calling, Nathan not bringing it up unless I did, both of us privately hoping, I think, that the silence meant she'd quietly let the idea go on her own. That hope ended on a Sunday afternoon when Nathan's aunt, Linda's younger sister Patricia, called him out of concern, mentioning that Linda had been telling extended family members Nathan was punishing her for trying to move the family forward, and that several relatives had already started reaching out to Nathan individually, gently encouraging him to reconsider, to let it go for the sake of family harmony at the wedding. I watched Nathan field 3 of these calls himself over the following days, each one following an almost identical script: sympathy for Linda's difficult years as a single mother, gentle pressure framed as concern for family unity, and an underlying implication that Nathan was somehow the unreasonable one for holding a boundary he'd set clearly, months in advance, for reasons everyone in the family already understood. I finally suggested something we probably should have done from the beginning, formally involving the wedding planner we'd hired, a woman named Grace who specialized in managing exactly this kind of family dynamic during high-stress planning periods. We scheduled a call with her, laid out the entire situation honestly, and asked for her professional guidance on how to handle a guest list dispute this contentious without letting it derail the rest of our planning. Grace was direct in a way that was genuinely helpful. She told us she'd seen versions of this exact situation more times than we'd probably want to know, one parent using the wedding as a stage for their own unresolved conflict with an ex-spouse, and that the only way to resolve it cleanly was for the couple, meaning us, to communicate the final decision in writing, clearly and unemotionally, removing any ambiguity that extended family members could exploit to keep pressuring us individually. Following her guidance, Nathan drafted a message to send to both his mother and, separately, to the relatives who'd been calling him. It stated plainly that the guest list for our wedding had been finalized months ago based on decisions we'd made together as a couple, that any changes needed to go through both of us directly, and that continued pressure from extended family on this topic would not change the outcome, only add unnecessary stress during an already demanding planning period. Sending that message felt like a genuine turning point, less because we expected it to immediately end the conflict, and more because it finally gave us language that removed the emotional manipulation from the equation entirely, reducing the situation to a simple, factual boundary instead of an ongoing debate anyone could weigh in on. Linda's response came within an hour, and it wasn't what either of us expected. Instead of anger or further pushback, she sent a single line back to Nathan, saying she needed some time to think and that she'd call him directly once she had. That silence, stretching over the following 4 days, felt heavier than any of the arguing that had come before it, because for the first time since this entire situation started, neither of us had any idea what Linda was actually planning to do next. Linda called on the 5th day, not to Nathan, but to me directly, which hadn't happened once through this entire situation. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me I needed to hear whatever this was myself rather than get it secondhand. Her tone was quieter than I expected, none of the earlier defensiveness or talk of moving forward as a family. She asked if we could meet in person, just the two of us, at a coffee shop, away from Nathan, away from any extended family who might hear about it and add their own commentary. I agreed, cautiously, and told Nathan afterward, who was visibly uneasy about me going alone but understood why I felt it was worth hearing her out directly, especially after everything Bill had shared about the actual timing of her sudden push for reconciliation. Sitting across from Linda 2 days later, I watched her struggle, genuinely struggle, to find the right words in a way I hadn't seen from her before. She eventually admitted, quietly, that Bill and Sandra's upcoming anniversary renewal had affected her more than she'd let herself acknowledge. That seeing them celebrate something so publicly happy had stirred up feelings about her own marriage ending that she thought she'd fully processed years ago, but apparently hadn't. She said she genuinely believed, at least at first, that inviting Sandra to our wedding was about modeling growth for Nathan. But sitting with everything that had happened over the past 2 weeks, including finally reading the written boundary Nathan had sent, she'd started to recognize that some part of her had wanted a moment where she could publicly demonstrate she'd moved past the divorce just as visibly as Bill and Sandra were about to, and that using our wedding to do that hadn't actually been fair to either of us. It wasn't a full apology in the way I think Nathan needed to hear directly from her, but it was more honest self-reflection than either of us had expected, especially given how defensive she'd been just days earlier with the extended family calls. I told her I appreciated her honesty and that I understood, on some level, how painful watching an ex-spouse's happiness could feel even years later. But I also told her, as clearly and kindly as I could, that Nathan's boundary about Sandra hadn't been about punishing anyone. It had been about protecting a version of himself that was still healing from a genuinely difficult adolescence. And that no amount of good intentions on her part changed the fact that she'd overridden that boundary without asking either of us first. Linda nodded, quiet for a long moment, then said she needed to call Sandra herself and properly rescind the invitations, framing it honestly this time instead of leaving Sandra confused about why plans had suddenly changed. I left that coffee shop feeling cautiously hopeful, more hopeful than I had in 2 weeks, but also aware that acknowledging a pattern honestly and actually changing long-held behavior are two very different things, and that this conversation, as meaningful as it felt, wasn't necessarily the end of what this entire situation was going to teach us about Linda's relationship with boundaries going forward. Linda did call Sandra, apparently the same evening as our coffee conversation, and rescinded the invitations honestly, according to what Bill relayed to Nathan a few days later, taking full responsibility for the miscommunication rather than framing it as our decision, which I genuinely appreciated given how easily she could have made us the villains in that conversation instead. For about 3 weeks after that, things settled into something that felt like real progress. Linda started communicating with us through the actual wedding planning channels instead of going around them, asking Grace directly about seating chart preferences instead of trying to negotiate changes through Nathan under emotional pressure. Nathan and his mother had 2 long phone calls during that stretch that he described afterward as the most honest conversations they'd had in years, not fully resolving the deeper pattern underneath everything, but at least opening the door to actually naming it out loud between them. I let myself believe, cautiously, that we'd moved past the worst of it, focusing back on the parts of wedding planning I'd actually been looking forward to, dress fittings, finalizing the ceremony readings, the small, joyful details that had gotten completely buried under 2 weeks of family conflict. Then, 6 weeks before the wedding, Grace called me directly with something that made my stomach drop all over again. She said she'd received a call from a florist we'd contracted, mentioning that the mother of the groom had reached out separately, asking about upgrading the centerpieces for a specific section of tables, and requesting the change be billed directly to her rather than to our main vendor account. I asked Grace which section of tables Linda had specified. When she read me the table numbers, I felt something cold settle in my chest, because those exact tables, the ones near the head table, close enough to be visible in nearly every photograph, were the tables we'd specifically assigned to Bill, and, if the earlier situation hadn't been resolved, would have included Sandra's seating as well. I called Nathan immediately, and together we called Linda that same evening, asking directly why she'd contacted our florist separately regarding those specific tables. Her explanation, delivered without the earlier softness from our coffee conversation, was that she simply wanted those particular tables to look extra special since they'd be prominently featured in photos, and that she didn't see any harm in personally covering an upgrade as a generous gesture. Nathan asked her point-blank if this had anything to do with Bill's table specifically, given everything that had already happened. There was a long pause before Linda admitted, quietly, that yes, some part of her had wanted that section to look particularly impressive, in case, and she trailed off before finishing the sentence. But both Nathan and I understood exactly what she'd been about to say. In case Sandra somehow still ended up there. In case there was still a version of this wedding where her carefully staged reconciliation moment could happen after all, dressed up now as generosity toward a florist bill instead of an outright guest list change. Sitting with that realization, I understood something neither of us had fully accepted yet, that the coffee shop conversation, as genuine as it had felt in the moment, hadn't actually resolved the underlying pattern. It had just temporarily redirected it into a quieter, harder to detect version of the exact same need. That phone call ended with Linda insisting, almost desperately, that she wasn't planning to invite Sandra again, that it was truly just about the flowers, but neither Nathan nor I fully believed that anymore, not after watching her admit, even in an incomplete sentence, exactly what had actually been driving the request. Nathan and I talked late into that night, working through something harder than the original guest list conflict had ever been, the question of how much access his mother should genuinely have to the wedding planning process going forward. Given that even a resolved conversation apparently hadn't stopped the underlying impulse from resurfacing in a quieter form just weeks later, we decided, together, on something neither of us took lightly. Going forward, all communication regarding vendors, seating, and logistics would go exclusively through Grace, our wedding planner, with Linda's role scaled back to what any other invited family member's role would be, present and welcome at the wedding itself, but no longer involved in behind-the-scenes planning decisions where she'd repeatedly shown she couldn't fully separate her own unresolved feelings about the divorce from what the day actually needed to be about. Nathan called his mother the next morning to explain this decision directly, calmly, without anger this time, just clear and final. He told her he loved her, that he understood the divorce had been genuinely painful for her in ways he was still learning to fully appreciate as an adult, but that he needed her to accept, completely, that this wedding was about him and me. Not a stage for anything else, however understandable her underlying feelings might be. Linda cried on that call, according to Nathan, but didn't argue the decision the way she had with the original boundary weeks earlier. He said something in her voice sounded different this time, less defensive, more like someone finally hearing something she'd been avoiding for a long time. 2 weeks later, something happened that neither of us expected. Linda reached out, not to renegotiate her role in the planning, but to ask if she could see a therapist she'd been putting off contacting for years, mentioning, almost sheepishly, that watching Bill and Sandra's happiness approach their anniversary had clearly stirred up more than she'd been willing to admit even to herself, and that maybe it was finally time to actually work through that instead of letting it quietly shape her decisions around important family moments. Nathan told me about that conversation with tears in his eyes, not because everything was suddenly resolved. 15 years of unprocessed grief doesn't undo itself in a single phone call, but because for the first time in this entire situation, his mother had taken real accountability for something deeper than just the wedding logistics, acknowledging a pattern instead of just managing its most recent symptom. With 5 weeks left until the wedding, Nathan and I finally felt like we could exhale, cautiously, and turn our full attention back to the parts of this process that were actually supposed to be joyful. The final 5 weeks of wedding planning felt almost unrecognizable compared to the chaos before them, quiet, focused, genuinely enjoyable in the way I'd imagined this process would feel from the very beginning. Linda started therapy, keeping mostly to herself about the details, but Nathan mentioned she'd called him twice during that stretch just to talk, not about the wedding at all, but about their family's history more generally. Asking him questions about how the divorce had actually affected him as a teenager, questions Nathan said she'd never once asked directly in 15 years. 3 weeks before the wedding, Linda asked, carefully, almost hesitantly, if she could take Nathan and me to dinner, just the three of us, to properly apologize in person rather than over the phone. We agreed, and sitting across from her that evening, I watched her deliver something that finally felt like the complete version of the apology she'd been circling for weeks. Acknowledging directly that she'd used our wedding to try to resolve something about her own life that had nothing to do with us, that Nathan's original boundary had been entirely reasonable, and that her repeated attempts to work around it, even in smaller forms like the flower situation, had been about her own unprocessed grief rather than anything either of us had actually done wrong. She also, without either of us bringing it up first, said she understood why we'd scaled back her involvement in the planning logistics and that she respected the decision completely, adding that honestly, stepping back from that responsibility had given her more space to actually work through her own feelings in therapy instead of channeling them into wedding details that were never really about flowers or seating charts in the first place. It was, genuinely, the most emotionally honest conversation I'd witnessed between Nathan and his mother in the 5 years I'd known her, and watching him finally receive an apology that matched the actual depth of what had happened, rather than the vague, defensive versions from weeks earlier, felt like its own kind of closure for both of us. 2 weeks before the wedding, Bill called Nathan with news of his own, that he and Sandra had decided to move their anniversary renewal ceremony to a different weekend entirely, specifically so it wouldn't overlap emotionally so closely with our wedding. A small, thoughtful gesture that Bill said came from a genuine place, wanting to give Nathan and me our own uncomplicated moment without any lingering tension from either side of the family bleeding into it. By the time our final walkthrough with Grace happened, 10 days before the wedding, everything felt settled in a way I hadn't been sure was possible 6 weeks earlier, sitting in that coffee shop across from Linda. Unsure if her honesty in that moment would actually translate into lasting change, or just another temporary redirection of the same underlying pattern. Standing in the vineyard during that walkthrough, looking out over the rows where our ceremony would actually take place in just over a week, I finally let myself feel something I hadn't been able to access fully during the entire chaotic middle stretch of this process: genuine excitement. Uncomplicated by guest list negotiations or florist phone calls, or the quiet anxiety of wondering what Linda might try next. Our wedding day, when it finally arrived, unfolded exactly the way I'd hoped it would from the very beginning, before any of this conflict ever started. Warm, joyful, and completely ours. Linda sat exactly where she was supposed to, in the second row on Nathan's side. No last-minute surprises, no unexpected guests, no quiet attempts to rearrange anything behind the scenes. During the reception, she gave a short toast, brief and genuinely heartfelt, thanking me for loving her son well and acknowledging, gently, in front of the whole room, that she'd learned a lot about herself over the past few months, framing it honestly without turning the moment into anything that centered her own story over ours. Bill was there too, seated comfortably, enjoying the evening without a hint of tension radiating from either side of the family, exactly the low-key presence Nathan had wanted from the very beginning of this entire planning process. Watching Nathan dance with his mother during the parent dance, seeing them both genuinely smiling, no forced politeness, no underlying tension I could sense even from across the room, felt like its own quiet resolution to everything we'd worked through together over those difficult months, proof that real repair, the slow, uncomfortable, honestly earned kind, was actually possible when someone finally chose to do the deeper work instead of just managing the surface-level symptoms. It's been 4 months since the wedding now, and Linda is still in therapy, something she's mentioned continuing without any prompting from either of us, saying it's helped her understand parts of her own history she'd spent years avoiding entirely. Her relationship with Nathan feels genuinely different, warmer, more honest, built on actual conversations instead of the careful, surface-level dynamic that had defined so much of their relationship before this all happened. Bill and Sandra had their vow renewal 3 weeks after our wedding, small and private exactly as planned, and Linda, notably, didn't ask a single question about it, didn't request details, seemed genuinely at peace letting that be entirely separate from anything happening in her own life. Looking back on everything, the guest list conflict that started this entire situation feels almost secondary now to what it actually revealed. 15 years of unprocessed grief quietly shaping decisions in ways Linda herself hadn't fully recognized until she was forced to sit with the consequences of trying to use our wedding as an unconscious stage for her own unresolved feelings. I don't think Nathan and I could have predicted, back when Melissa first called about 6 mysterious extra guests, that the whole situation would eventually lead somewhere this meaningful, his mother finally getting real support she needed. Their relationship genuinely deepening instead of just returning to its previous careful distance, all of it growing out of a boundary we simply refuse to let anyone quietly override without an honest conversation first. So here's what I actually want to know from all of you. If your future mother-in-law tried to secretly invite people to your wedding that your partner had specifically asked to keep off the guest list, would you have handled it as patiently as we did, giving her room to work through her own feelings? Or would you have drawn a harder line immediately? Let me know honestly in the comments below.